I was gone for 11 days. That is the part people always fix on when I tell this story. The 11 days. As though the number itself contains the mystery. As though if I could explain the 11 days satisfactorily, everything else would arrange itself into sense. I have been explaining it for 47 years, and I have never once made it fully sensible. Because the truth is that some things that happen in forests in the dead of winter do not arrange themselves into sense, no matter how many times you turn them over in the light. What I can tell you is what I know, what I saw, what I carried back with me through the snow on that 12th morning when I came out of the tree line into the convent yard with a child in my arms and 6 inches of ice in my habit. And Sister Margarita dropped her water bucket and screamed loud enough to wake the dead, of whom that winter there were considerable numbers in our region. My name is Sister Benedicta Zaleska, and I entered the forest on the 4th of January, 1936, and I returned from it on the 15th. And the child I brought back with me had no name that anyone knew, and no origin that anyone could trace, and eyes the particular gray of deep winter sky that I have never seen on another human face in all the years since. This is what happened, or as much of what happened as I have ever been able to put into words. The convent of the Nativity sat at the edge of the Puszcza Augustowska, the great forest of northeastern Poland, in a way that people who have not seen that forest cannot properly imagine. It did not border the forest. It did not overlook the forest. It existed at the precise boundary where the human world and the forest world met and maintained a kind of uneasy negotiation, each encroaching slightly on the other, depending on the season. In winter, the forest came forward, the trees pressing closer in the way that trees in deep cold seem to lean inward, and the convent felt smaller, held, surrounded by something that had been there enormously longer than anything we had built, and that would remain enormously longer than anything we would leave behind. I had lived at that boundary for 16 years by January 1936, and I had made my peace with the forest, the way you make peace with a neighbor who is vastly more powerful than you and has simply chosen, for reasons of their own, not to exercise that power against you. I respected it. I did not romanticize it. I had grown up in the countryside outside Suwalki, and I knew what forests did to people who forgot that respect and went into them without preparation or humility. I was 38 years old that winter, and I had been the convent's primary liaison with the scattered communities of the surrounding region for 7 years, which meant that I walked. I walked to the small villages that existed in the forest clearings, carrying medicines and messages, and occasionally a sister who needed medical attention back the other way. I knew the paths. I knew the landmarks. I knew the forest in winter, and I knew it in the mud season, and I knew it in the green abundance of high summer when it became almost benign. I was not a woman who got lost. I want to be clear about that, because what happened beginning on the 4th of January was not the story of a woman who wandered into the forest and became confused. It was the story of something else entirely, something for which I do not have a fully adequate name and have stopped trying to find one. I had set out on the 4th of January to reach the village of Stebrovo, 8 kilometers northeast through the forest, where a family named Wojnowski had sent word that their grandmother was very ill and not expected to survive the week. I had made that walk perhaps 30 times over the years. I had supplies for 2 days in my pack, the medicines Sister Irena had prepared, food enough for the journey there and back, and a blanket that had served me on winter forest walks since my first year at the convent. The morning was cold and clear, and the snow that had fallen 3 days earlier lay undisturbed on the path, which told me no one had come or gone from Stebrovo since the snowfall, which was not unusual in deep January. I walked for 2 hours, and I was perhaps 5 kilometers into the forest when I heard the sound. I have spent 47 years deciding how to describe that sound, and I have never found the description that does not make the person hearing it look at me the way people look at someone they are reassessing. So I will simply tell you what it was and leave the reassessing to you. It was crying, a child crying, coming from somewhere off the path to the left, in the direction of a dense section of spruce that I knew from summer walks to conceal a small frozen stream and a depression in the ground where the stream had once run before it changed course. The crying was not loud. It was the kind of crying that comes from a child who has been crying for a very long time and has moved past the stage of expecting a response and into the stage of crying simply because stopping would require more energy than continuing. I recognized that stage because I had heard it in the sick room at the convent when children had been ill for many days. I left the path. I pushed through the spruce branches, knocking snow down onto myself, and I followed the sound into the depression by the frozen stream, and I found her there. She was perhaps 3 years old, perhaps 4, small for whichever age she was, sitting in the hollow of an enormous fallen pine, with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, and her face so red from the cold that the redness had moved past alarm into something that frightened me immediately and practically. She was wearing a dress that was entirely wrong for winter, a summer dress of thin cotton, dark blue, with no coat and no boots, only thin leather shoes that were soaked completely through. She had no hat. Her hair, which was dark and very fine, was matted with something I did not immediately identify, and later understood was dried blood from a wound on the back of her head that had stopped bleeding some hours earlier. She looked at me when I pushed through the branches, and she did not scream, and she did not reach for me, and she did not speak. She simply looked at me with those gray eyes and continued the low, persistent crying that had led me to her, as though my arrival was a fact she was registering, but not yet prepared to assign meaning to. I stripped off my outer habit immediately and wrapped her in it, and I pulled her against my body for warmth, and I looked around the depression for any indication of how she had come to be there. There were no tracks in the snow except mine coming in. There were no tracks anywhere near that fallen pine. I looked at the snow surrounding her hollow for a long time, because this was not a small anomaly. A child in a forest in January with no coat and no boots, and no tracks around her in fresh snow that had fallen 3 days earlier, is not an anomaly you file away for later. It is something you stand in and look at and try to find an explanation for with every rational capacity you possess. I found no explanation. The snow around her was undisturbed. She was simply there, in a hollow in a fallen pine, in the middle of the Puszcza Augustowska, with no coat and no tracks, and gray eyes, and a wound on her head that was already several hours old. I made a decision in the next 30 seconds that any sensible woman with 16 years of forest knowledge would have made. I was 5 kilometers from the convent. I was 8 kilometers from Stebrovo. The child's core temperature, judging by her color and her coordination when I lifted her, was dangerously low. Stebrovo had a stove and a family who would help, but 8 kilometers through deep snow carrying a child was not survivable for her in her current state. The convent was closer, and I knew the path. I turned back. I did not reach the Winovsky grandmother. I have thought about that sometimes in the years since. Whether old Pani Wojnowska died that week waiting for the medicines I did not deliver, and I have made my peace with that uncertainty the same way I have made my peace with everything about those 11 days, which is to say, imperfectly and permanently. I did not make it back to the convent that day. This is the part that requires me to ask you to trust my forest knowledge again, because I knew that path, and what happened on it should not have happened. 2 hours into my return journey, with the child bundled inside my habit against my chest, the path simply changed. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way I can fully articulate. The trees were the same trees. The snow was the same snow. But the path I had walked 30 times delivered me to a place I did not recognize. A small frozen lake that had no business being where it was, that I had never encountered in 16 years of walking those trails. I stood at its edge for a long time, and I looked at it. And the child against my chest had stopped crying, and was sleeping with the heavy, unconscious sleep of extreme cold that I knew I needed to warm her out of immediately. And so I made camp. I made fire with the materials I carried, because I always carried fire materials in winter, and I held the child as close to the warmth as was safe, and I fed her small amounts of the bread I had brought, and she swallowed it without waking fully, and her color began to improve, and I sat through that first night in the forest, with my back against a pine tree, and the fire between us, and the lake shining in the darkness, and something watching from the trees that I heard but never saw. The 11 days did not feel like 11 days. This is the honest account, and I will not dress it differently. They felt like a sustained present tense, each day complete in itself, without clear connection to the one before or the one after. I kept the child alive and warm. I found the convent path again on the third day and lost it again on the fourth. I found water under ice, and I found the particular bark that could be boiled into something with enough nutritional value to keep us moving. The child began to speak on the fifth day, or what I counted as the fifth day, and what she said was not Polish. It was not any language I recognized from my limited experience of languages, which included Polish and some German and the liturgical Latin we used in the chapel. It was something with a rhythm and a texture that I can still hear if I sit quietly and let myself go back to those days. Something that felt ancient in the way the forest felt ancient, which is to say, beyond the reach of any history I had been taught. She told me her name on what I counted as the seventh day. She said it clearly and repeated it when I asked her to, and I learned it. And I will tell you that I do not write it here because in all the years since I have felt strongly that it belonged to her and to whatever she came from, and was not mine to distribute. I called her Malgorzata in the convent, the name the bishop assigned her when she was baptized in March of that year, and she accepted that name with the equanimity of a child who understood that names were things people gave you, and that having multiple names was simply a fact of existing in more than one world. We came out of the forest on the morning of the 15th. I do not know how. I know that I woke on what I had counted as the 11th night, with the absolute certainty that the path was directly north of where I was sleeping, and I rose before dawn, and I walked north, and the path was there, exactly as I had known it would be. And I followed it, and 2 hours later I walked into the convent yard with the child in my arms, and Sister Margareta dropped her water bucket and screamed. The child looked at the convent, and then looked at me, and then looked back at the convent with those gray winter eyes, and she reached up and put her small, cold hand against my cheek, and said something in the language I did not know, something that carried in its sound the particular quality of a thing concluded, a thing arrived at, a thing finally and completely done. I had her examined by the doctor from Augusto, who came 3 days later. He found the healed wound on her head and the evidence of significant cold exposure and malnutrition, consistent with several days in the winter forest, and nothing else remarkable. He estimated her age at 3 to 4 years. He could find no record of a missing child matching her description in any of the surrounding communities. The gendarmerie investigated for 6 weeks and found nothing. No family came forward. No village reported a missing girl. She had come from nowhere that anyone could locate, which I had known since the moment I found her in a hollow pine, with no tracks in the snow around her, and which I eventually stopped trying to explain and started simply accepting as the condition of her existence, and therefore of mine. Malgorzata grew up at the convent of the Nativity. She was quick and serious, and learned Polish completely within 8 months, and never again spoke the other language in my hearing, though I sometimes caught her in the garden speaking quietly to something I could not see, in sounds that had that same ancient rhythm I remembered from the forest. She did not become a nun. She became a teacher in the village school outside Augustau, and she taught for 34 years and was known for a quality of attention she brought to every child in her classroom that parents described as the feeling that she saw their child completely, not just the surface of them, but the whole depth. She died in 1989, at what we estimated to be 57 years old, with the same gray eyes she had arrived with and the same quality of stillness that had characterized her from the first morning I found her in the hollow pine. She never told me where she had come from. I never asked. Some things that begin in forests are completed there, and the completion is not a question answered, but a presence honored. And honoring it was the work I had been given, and I did it. And I would do it again without hesitation every time.